The missing episode animations have been a great way of enjoying these lost classics, but sadly not all of these releases are made equally. So with the recent release of Evil of the Daleks, I've decided to rank and give my thoughts on them all. And so here are our categories. We've got Da Best of Da Best, there's Nicely Done, there's Basically Good, Could Have Been Better, Don't Do This, and let's not go there. Okay, so first off we've got The Invasion. This was the first animation of this kind they tried, and in many ways I still think it's one of the best. These days the animation is a little dated looking, but considering it's 15 years old at this point, I feel we can all cut it some slack. What I really appreciate with this release is the direction. I think there's a really good range of shots in there, and it really captures the feeling of watching an old 60s Doctor Who story. Though it's clear there's limitations in how much motion they can show, I think the range of shots really helps give the animation a sense of life. I also think the likenesses are pretty good. Not spot on, but very much recognisable as the characters they're intended to be. So I'm putting this one in Da Best of Da Best. Next came Reign of Terror in 2013, which was animated by Planet 55. This one's a bit of a strange one. I have a lot of respect for the art style they were going for with the highly detailed characters and shading, but sadly the facial animation rig they chose to go with has a very strange, uncanny look to it. It is nice to see the range of movement they can get, but they begin to rely on it almost a little too heavily, limiting most shots to being these intense close-ups of faces. Sometimes the editing is really quite bizarre in this release, with these really rapid and awkward cuts all over the place, making it a bit of a distracting experience. It is quite impressive to see more frame-by-frame animation, but overall this one ain't really it. So I'm putting this in Could Have Been Better. Next up was The Ice Warriors, which was handed off to Quirios? Is that what they were called? It is Quirios. So next came The Ice Warriors, animated by a company whose name I can't pronounce. I think this is another divisive one. The art style is quite a departure from the previous two releases, going for something far more cartoonish and simple. One thing I do have to respect this release for is just how closely it matches the original telesnaps. The team really wanted to go for something that felt like it could have been shot in studio in the 60s. And considering this is a release intended to fill gaps within a mostly existing story, I do think that was the best way to approach this. The character likenesses are pretty decent, though Troughton looks a little odd, but sadly the lack of shading and slightly awkward motion makes this one a bit of a distracting watch. One thing that did bug me was the way that characters moved. There seemed to be a little too much easing on their limbs as they flailed around, making them feel weirdly floppy and puppet-like. However, considering this release had an absolutely tiny budget, I don't feel like I can be too harsh on this. I'm going to stick this one in Basically Good because whilst it's not amazing, it does a good job of approximating the missing footage, and there's clearly a lot of attention and detail put into it. Next, Planet 55 returned again with The 10th Planet. This is certainly a step up from the last one. Gone is the slightly awkward 3D motion warping face stuff that they used, and now there's far more frame-by-frame animation. It's pretty impressive how much the footage can actually match up sometimes, with the opening to episode 4 being painstakingly recreated. Every so often you can pick up vague anime influences, which can be a little bit distracting, but this is likely due to the involvement of Paul Johnson, who was pretty notable for his incredibly impressive fan Doctor Who anime he produced. The dude is incredibly talented and has a clear affection for the old 80s style of highly shaded anime, something that I think does complement the black and white visuals these stories had. I'm going to put this one in Nicely Done, as whilst it's one of the best we've had so far, I think every so often there are certain things that hold it back from being truly immersive. Then comes the Moonbase with Planet 55 again. I do think this one is a step up from the 10th Planet. Quite similar in style, but ever so slightly more realistic and detailed. There's a ton of frame-by-frame animation in this one, which must have been painstaking, but looks great, and the shading and art direction does a great job of matching the existing footage. I think the likenesses in this one are pretty damn strong. However, there are the odd moments where the limitations do shine through. On quite a few occasions it becomes clear that people's heads are awkwardly disconnected from their body animation, and you can still see that slight anime influence, which I don't exactly mind. In terms of filling the gaps between episodes, this is definitely one of the best ones, and so that's why I'm putting it in Da Best of Da Best. It was then 2 years before the next missing episode animation, and what we got was quite a significant one. Up until this point, most of the animations had been plugging gaps in stories which mostly existed, generally following a rule of 2 episodes or less. But then along comes Power of the Daleks with a whopping 6 completely missing episodes to animate. I've heard that the majority of this animation had to be completed within 6 months, which is absolutely tiny considering it's over 2 hours worth of story. And sadly, you can tell that they were strained with this release. The animation of this release is much more in line with the Ice Warriors, relying on a simpler art style and motion-tweened character rigs. Movement can often feel quite clunky or fail to match the original performances. However, the Daleks do look fantastic and are easily the standout of this release. The updated 2020 release does improve things somewhat, updating some of the animation and introducing new lighting effects. Despite all its flaws, I do feel this animation does a good job of conveying the story. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in the basically good category. So I wasn't sure if I should include this one, but I figured it's probably worth a mention, and that's the Shada animation. Not a missing episode in the same way as the others, but still an interesting release. It was done by the same team as Power of the Daleks, and you can tell they had a better time and budget with this one. The animation isn't great necessarily, but it's a lot smoother and has some pretty impressive camera motion and effects. I think it also helps that they had new audio made completely from scratch for this animation, which is a lot easier to animate with than already existing audio that's over 50 years old. I'm going to stick this one in basically good, as whilst not flawless, the transition between live action and animated segments is pretty seamless. With this, there was another slight pause in animations until we got the announcement of the Macra Terra, which was completed by Sun and Moon Studios. I remember this being an exciting release, not only because I'd always wanted to watch the Macra Terra, but also because the quality of the animation seemed to be a significant step up from the last two. I think this release contains easily some of the best character animation we've seen, with Sun and Moon Studios producing these incredibly elaborate animation rigs that gave a huge range of motion to our characters. It's incredibly smooth and very expressive, plus the backgrounds and lighting is once again really lovely. Being another release that has no existing episodes to keep in line with, the team took quite a few liberties with the art direction of this story. Rather than limiting themselves to what would have been capable on the 60s budget, they beefed the story up, giving us bigger, more elaborate sets, and a much more impressive and threatening Macra. However, because of this I do have mixed feelings towards this release. The animation is gorgeous, and I really like the bigger budget feel it has, but this does unfortunately mean it jars somewhat with the rather cronky sounding 60s audio. Moments like Polly getting picked up by a Macra are impressive, but feel kind of out of place with what you're hearing.
What is it? Get it off me! Get it off me, man!
And at times I feel the design just differs a little too much from the original. The sleeping quarters where our companions stay look distinctly cold and metallic, which seems at odds with the fluffy exterior presented by the colony. And looking at the original telesnaps, it feels quite clear to me that this look wasn't really intended. I mean, where are their I'm pretty sure they have bed sheets in the original and that they're just not there in the remake. On a technical level, I would put this into best of the best, but because of the jarring nature of the audio and the animation, it's gonna have to go in nicely done for me. The year after Macra, we had the Faceless Ones, which followed with a very similar style. However, watching the animation, it's clear that this one isn't quite up to the same quality as Macra. I think the lighting and some character likenesses are pretty good, but sadly Jamie and the Doctor look really odd in this one. Jamie doesn't really look a thing like Jamie, and the Doctor has this weird case of baby head going on, like his forehead is gigantic. As well, there's a clear dip in animation quality in terms of things like motion and character animation. Things are distinctly more flat and puppeted than the depthier, more expressive animation seen in Macra. However, it's still a fairly competent production and does a good job of telling the story, so I'm going to put it in basically good. And not long after that, we get Fury from the Deep. I think this one is another divisive one. After the slight dip in quality with the Faceless Ones, especially the distracting character likenesses, I was very much looking forward to Fury from the Deep being an improvement, perhaps even a return to form, but sadly Fury's animation isn't much of a step forward. I admire their attempts at a new art style, but the thick black lines do feel a little too cartoonish to me, and the exaggerated proportions of characters are occasionally distracting. The likenesses are all around fairly decent, if quite stylized, though I'm not very convinced by Jamie's likeness. However, the animation is noticeably choppy in this release. It kind of looks like it's animated on twos, but considering this is a motion-tweened, puppeted animation, I'm not really sure why they'd do this. Perhaps it was to create a more coherent final result or reduce the workload, but it can make the animation look a little choppy and cheap at times. Once again, they took liberties with this release, creating bigger and more ambitious sets, but I do think it's somewhat at odds with the spookier, claustrophobic tone of the story. Whilst I do really like the backgrounds, and some shots can even look quite impressive, there's this weird tendency to render everything in these extreme wide angles, and that can then make our 2D characters feel like they're more so placed in front of the background rather than actually occupying it. All too often I feel like scenes are made to play out in wide shots rather than taking advantage of different angles, and that can give the animation a bit of a stilted, cheap vibe. Of course, this animation's production was quite heavily affected by COVID, and you can definitely tell that they were taking shortcuts in places, finding opportunities to reduce the workload by covering mouths to avoid lip syncing or cutting weirdly so as to avoid animating certain segments. I obviously appreciate the effort that went into this release, but I found it to be ultimately a bit too distracting for me, and I've never quite been able to make my way through the story because of it. So I'm going to put this one in could have been better. I do think it's a shame that so many of these projects are rushed out, considering there's a good chance we will never actually recover these episodes. You've presumably got as long as you need to animate them and make them as good as possible. And there were quite a few horror stories of overworked and underpaid animators given horrific time constraints to finish these releases. So the next missing episode animation release would go in quite a different direction, and one that I really wasn't too keen on when it was first announced. The Web of Fear has become pretty infamous at this point, so I won't try to dog on it too much, but yeah, I'm really not a fan of this style. I have to credit them for trying, and I think they definitely had the right idea with some of what they were doing. But the actual art style of the episodes is really ugly to me. I'm not keen on how the characters look at all, especially the Brigadier's creepy, beady eyes. I think the increased depth and range of motion that 3D allows is nice, but sadly the animation so far has been pretty subpar. Characters' limbs are floaty and gesticulate wildly, like it's unfiltered raw motion capture data that's just been plonked onto these characters. I'm sure there's a lot of work that went into this that we unfortunately can't see, and I can only imagine that it's been a nightmare to put any of these releases together. But considering this is now looking to be the actual future of where these animated releases will go, I can only hope they spend some more time getting the motion and likenesses to be just a little bit nicer. As of right now, it looks more like an ambitious fan project than an actual official release that you pay money for. Even the Yeti and the Telesnap reconstruction is a lot better animated than what we actually see in the animation. Now, I can understand why this animation ended up this way. On the one hand, it is only one episode, so you'd expect they'd be able to concentrate their budget and efforts and make a really impressive product. But on the other hand, it's only one episode, and that's going to be a lot of assets to create for merely 25 minutes of animation. Ultimately, I'd really prefer if they didn't go with this style, or if they did, they found some ways to drastically improve it. But for now, I'm putting the Web of Fear in let's not go there, because please, BBC, let's not do that again. Well, don't do this. It's kind of sort of in between the two. It's just let's not do this. There's probably one category called let's not do this, and the only thing there is the Web of Fear, because please don't do this. And that brings us to our most recent release with The Evil of the Daleks. Going into this one, considering the past two animations, I was a little concerned. But after watching it, I'm pretty happy to say that The Evil of the Daleks has been something of a return to form for Doctor Who animations. I still don't think it quite beats The Invasion or The Moon Base. The animation still uses the simpler motion tween style seen in more recent releases, but in general I think character likenesses and the movement is much improved from especially Fury. With this release, I was able to fully immerse myself in the story and forget that I was watching a missing episode animation, something only the best of these releases managed to do. This release also contains a pretty impressive variety of shots, as well as some really nice lighting. It avoids the feeling of things playing out in awkward flat wides, giving a real sense of depth to the scenes and characters. And even some of the more elaborate motion they cover is handled pretty well, and certainly brings a lot to the sequences in which Jamie navigates the traps of the house by himself. That's not to say there aren't still some jankier moments of animation in here, but they're much less numerous and distracting than in previous releases. Admittedly, the likeness of Troughton is a little odd. He kind of has these weird two dots in between his eyes that just distracted me the whole time. Are they meant to be wrinkles? Because they don't really look like wrinkles. I'm not sure what they are. I especially noticed just how much personality they injected into the character animation of this release. The body language really complements the performances instead of feeling disconnected from it. And much like Power, the Daleks once again look really great here. I've started to hear some criticisms of this release, and whilst it is not perfect, it's worth considering that this is a whopping 7-episode animation. I think the longest that they've done so far. And for them to have maintained such a consistent level of quality throughout them is certainly noteworthy. I was also particularly impressed by the audio restoration work on this release. Considering it's over 50 years old at this point, it sounded really clear and actually quite modern in places. and definitely helped to make this one of the most immersive missing episode animations I've watched so far. Whilst I don't think this animation is as good as the Invasion or the Moon Base, I'm still going to put it in the best of the best, purely for the impressive feat it was and how well they managed to pull it off. And so there we go. Overall, the Doctor Who missing episode animations have been pretty decent. With these, you always have to take into consideration the time and budget constraints they had, as well as the fact that they're working with visualless audio that was once attached to a live-action TV program made 50 years in the past. I'd personally love if more money and time could be put into these projects to ensure they're the best that they can be, but considering the niche appeal of classic Doctor Who, especially classic Doctor Who missing episode animations, I can understand that that's probably not something particularly feasible for the time being. Having said that, I do hope the future for Doctor Who animation is brighter than it has been in recent years. Whilst we've had a few standouts, some of the more recent releases like Fury, The Faceless Ones, and especially The Web of Fear show a slight dip in quality again that can prove distracting when trying to enjoy these stories. And if Web of Fear is the template for Doctor Who animation going forward, I can only hope they take the time to iron out its various flaws and quirks. So, I mean, if you want, you can tell me which one you like best, but, I don't know, I hate, how do you end a video? I hate ending videos. I'm not gonna ask you to subscribe, because that's stupid. I'm not gonna ask you to like this video. Don't comment. Dislike this video. Unsubscribe and dislike this video, please. Report my channel for terrorism. Because I put the Web of Fear in last place. I hope the Abominable Snowman is good. That would be nice.